Hello, and welcome to my channel. This is a content warning for what may be discussed in the upcoming video. Subjects such as self-harm and murder will be discussed in depth, and if you feel sensitive to those topics, I would suggest giving it a skip. If not, enjoy the video.
The music industry is an extremely influential industry. But when something like that grows so large, there is always a darker side. Metal is a genre within this industry that is home to its fair share of problems, which can even extend to the darkest of crimes a human can commit. The story of the Norwegian black metal band Mayhem is one such example, and the history is one filled with a multitude of crimes, the most prominent being the murder of one of its founders. To fully explain what happened to Mayhem, we need to go back and have a look at the origins of Norwegian black metal, which may sound quite niche, but this genre of music has influenced metal across the world, and understanding its past will allow us to see why the events that occurred with Mayhem ever happened. The early Norwegian black metal scene is often credited for being the spark that ignited the black metal industry as a whole, and it isn't hard to see why. Bands like Mayhem were extremely influential, not only to the sound of modern black metal, but also to the culture surrounding it. Whether that is a good thing or not, however, is debatable, as its history is a dark one. The core members of the black metal scene referred to themselves as the Black Circle, a not so subtle nod to their ideological beliefs. The circle consisted of mostly young men and contained a multitude of bands. These men would often meet at a record shop in Oslo, going by the name Helvete. They were extremely anti-Christian, but they were also opposed to other organized religion. The group often viewed themselves as militant Satanists, separate from the regular Church of Satan that was slowly gaining popularity. They often viewed the Church of Satan as too humane and devoted themselves to the darker side of those beliefs. The Black Circle often fell into the stereotypical side of Satanism that fueled the satanic panic during the 80s and 90s. They were devoted solely to spreading fear and chaos, and would often turn to crime to fuel their goals. There had been church burnings occasionally during the 80s, but in the early 90s it started to pick up at an alarming pace. The black metal scene in general started to target churches as a part of its satanistic ideology, and reveled in the fear they had brought on the local populace. Mayhem's members were deeply connected to the church burnings, as their members had no problem talking about what they had been doing. Ironically, the two members most deeply connected to their future tragedy were planning the bombing of the Nidaros Cathedral, a historical monument that would have brought them far more attention, especially as it would have coincided with their latest album release. This, however, never happened. I could go more in depth on the individual arson cases, but that would make this video far too long and quite repetitive. Many in the black metal scene to this day still praise the church burnings, seeing them as a good way of fighting back against organized religion, while others see them as futile, a pointless endeavor that never made a difference. The culprits of these burnings obviously felt no remorse, and were happy with spreading the fear and chaos that they had hoped to spread when joining the Black Circle. There was barely an ideology being pushed there, and there was no relationship between these attacks and the actual Church of Satan. The black metal industry and the death metal industry were also very close at this time, as the death metal industry took on a lot of the characteristics of its predecessor. However, many in the black metal industry hated death metal bands, seeing them as too mainstream and too soft. Public opinion to all of this was quite mixed. Law enforcement obviously saw them as a serious threat, as did any detractors of black metal. Yet to many, these initial attacks were seen as a form of counterculture, fighting against an oppressive religion and freeing themselves from the regular social confines of modern society. Black metal's history is very sordid, but of course, a few burned churches are nowhere near as bad as it gets. The only way to truly dive into this history is to view the most influential band of the time and the topic of this video. And so we move on to the origins and dark history of the band Mayhem.
Mayhem was founded in 1984 by guitarist Oystein Arseth, going by the stage name Destructor at first, but later as Euronymous. Bassist Jorn Stubbard, who went by the stage name Necrobutcher, and drummer Jettel Mannheim, who I assume did not go by a stage name. The band took their name from a song by the band Venom, who was also one of their biggest influences. The name came from the song Mayhem with Mercy. I obviously cannot play it due to copyright, but it is clear to see that they were of a similar style to what Mayhem's music would later become. Venom was not the only influence that Mayhem drew from, however, as they were influenced by a large group of metal bands that were popular at the time, most notably Black Sabbath and Motorhead. Mayhem actually started as a cover band for these bands, but would later grow out of this and create their unique sound with their first demo, Pure Fucking Armageddon. After this release, they hired another two members, Eirik Norheim, who went by the stage name Messiah, and Sven Erik Christiansen, who went by the stage name Maniac. However, in 1985, Norheim left the band, only 2 years before Mayhem recorded their first EP, Death Crush. The EP was reissued in 1993 after its initial 1,000 copies had sold out rather quickly. The reissue was a joint venture with a specialist record store, one mentioned previously in this video, Helveta. One notable fact is that this record store was actually owned by Euronymous, cementing him into the history of black metal and a key member of the Black Circle. But this reissue is getting ahead of the story, and there is far more to Mayhem's history. Sven Erik Christiansen left the band in 1988, along with one of the band's founding members, Jettel Mannheim. The departure of these two members marked a major turning point in the band's future, as they were replaced by a local drummer, John Axel Blomberg, who went by the stage name Hellhammer, and a Swedish vocalist, Pelle Ingvar Öhrlin, who's better known by his stage name Dead. Dead in particular was a member that would forever shape the image for the band, for better or for worse, as his eccentricities are some of the most memorable facets of his time playing for Mayhem. Dead would often wear ghoulish paint while on stage, something those in the industry referred to as corpse paint, and he would play into this deathly appearance, burying his clothes the day before performing, and then digging them up and wearing them before going on stage. However, his appearance was not the only notable fact about Dead, as he was also known to harm himself on stage, often cutting himself with broken glass or a hunting knife. This could have been an inclination to suicidal ideation, and sadly his legacy would slowly become one of the many dark marks in Mayhem's history. In 1990, the band bought a small home near Oslo, and they would use this house for rehearsals. But most of the time, the members would also live here, staying in quite close proximity. There were often disagreements between the band, particularly between Dead and Euronymous. The two would constantly argue and try to get at each other in many ways. Euronymous would torment Dead by playing loud music while he slept, specifically a genre of music Dead hated, leading him to go outside and sleep in the woods. Upon which Euronymous would go outside and begin shooting a shotgun into the air, further tormenting his fellow bandmate. There are also accounts that Dead once attacked Euronymous, stabbing him, which might be a morbid form of foreshadowing for Euronymous' fate later on. This all came to a tragic head in 1991 when Euronymous found dead in the house, his wrists cut, with a shotgun wound to the head. While his suicide was extremely tragic, Euronymous wasted no time in buying a camera and using it to take pictures of the scene, along with collecting certain items from the scene, all before calling the police. He collected viscera from the scene for his own use, to either sell it or make jewelry from it, which he gifted to those he deemed worthy of his respect. There are also rumors that Euronymous engaged in cannibalism with some of the remains, but these are merely rumors and should not be believed. After the event, Euronymous called fellow band member Necrobutcher and told him about the event. Instead of grieving, Euronymous seemed to celebrate the death, causing more animosity between him and his fellow bandmates. Euronymous would later go on to use one of the photos of the scene on an album cover. This turned some of the band members against him, with Necrobutcher eventually leaving the band over it. Necrobutcher even contemplated killing his former leader over his treatment of Dead's suicide. However, someone else would beat him to it. Now, before I move to the next part, I would like to make it known that there is a conspiracy that Euronymous killed Dead, instead of it being a suicide. I'm on the fence about this, as Euronymous went to great efforts to get Dead into the band, and Dead did show signs of poor mental health before the event. Yet it still has to be noted that Euronymous also owned a shotgun. He was the first person on the scene, and his reluctance to call the police made it seem like he reveled in the death. Regardless, none of that matters as we move on to the next part of Mayhem's tale. Now we come to the turning point of this story. It has already gotten quite dark, but now it reaches a whole new level. After Dead's suicide, there was a sense of animosity that had started to grow within the band. People really got along, but when it came to Euronymous himself, pretty much everyone disliked him. But since the band was still missing a member, they needed new blood to boost their ranks. Many metal bands, both old and new, would meet at Helvete, and since Mayhem and Euronymous were pretty well known in the industry at this point, and Euronymous would often mentor new bands and upcoming artists, recommending them to record labels, Euronymous and Varg Vikernes started out as friends, with the former taking the latter under his wing, eventually inviting Varg to play bass for the band, a role previously held by the now deceased Dead. The friendship, however, slowly turned into a sort of rivalry, with the two trying to one-up each other with their evil deeds. Euronymous may have gotten more involved in the church burnings because of this rivalry, and the animosity between the two began to grow, coming to a head on the 10th of August 1993. On that fateful night, Vikernes drove to Euronymous' apartment in Oslo, and during a dispute, reportedly stabbed him 23 times, twice in the head, 5 times in the neck, and 16 times in the back. There is no doubt that Varg killed Euronymous, but there is a lot of speculation about the motive leading up to the event. There are multiple accounts on what could have led to that fateful night. Some suggest there was a power struggle, that Varg hated Euronymous for his role in the band, and wanted to dispose of him for this. Another possible motive is money. Euronymous owed Varg a large sum of royalty payments, and an argument over this could have turned violent. It may not even be so complicated, as there was a previous stabbing in Lillehammer that was also tied to the black metal scene. This could have been an attempt to outdo this previous crime. But there is one claim that is far more interesting. An account that came from Varg Vikernes himself. According to Varg, This was all a case of mere self-defense. He claimed that Euronymous planned to stun him with a taser, tie him up, and torture him to death, all while filming the event. Vikernes says that he would not have taken the threat seriously in a normal setting, but since he had heard it from a friend, and that Euronymous had apparently speaking about it with some of his own close friends, Varg took the threat to heart. On that night, apparently, Euronymous had planned to use a fake contract to lure Vikernes to his house, and during the dispute upon him arriving, Euronymous had grabbed a knife and in the struggle was killed. Varg even claimed that most of Euronymous' injuries were sustained from his antics on stage, not even from the fight. Personally, I highly doubt this. The events surrounding the attack and even afterwards paint Varg in a different light. He disposed of his bloody clothes on the way home, and he didn't even go to the meeting alone. Vikernes went to the meeting with another musician, Snorre Ruch, who went by the stage name Blackthorn. Ruch later claimed that Vikernes planned to kill Euronymous. Vikernes of course denied this, but this claim would later come up in the trial related to the murder. Varg was arrested only 9 days after the murder itself, on the 19th of August 1993. The trial would begin the following year, on the 2nd of May 1994. The claim that this murder was planned ahead of time proved to be the primary argument during the trial, and supporting this was a supposed third conspirator to the murder, someone who would remain at Varg's home to help form an alibi. The trial did not last very long, only about 2 weeks, the conclusion being Varg's sentencing to 21 years in prison, not only for the murder of Euronymous, but also for the arson of 3 churches, the attempted arson of a 4th, and the theft of 150 kilograms of explosives, which presumably would have been used in the planned bombing of the Nidaros Cathedral. One notable fact to remember is that Varg never confessed to the murder. He kept up the argument that it was self-defense. In some sort of show of support, 2 churches were burnt on the day of Vikernes' sentencing. Along with Vikernes, Ruch was also sentenced to 8 years in prison for being an accomplice. Vikernes was released from prison in 2009, and while the trial and the chaos surrounding it are certainly interesting, so is the history of Varg himself, and by extension his musical project, Burzum. Varg Vikernes was born in Norway in 1973. His mother worked at an oil company, and his father was an electronical engineer. His early life tends to be a small precursor of what was to come, as while it was peaceful for the most part, it was not without any notable events. When Varg was 6, he and his family moved to Baghdad for a year, and this was because his father had quite a unique career opportunity, allegedly working for Saddam Hussein himself. As Varg grew, his more controversial opinions in regards to race started to become quite prominent, as at an early age he already had an inflated sense of self-worth, and found himself to be others in terms of race. His father disagreed with these views, and his mother claimed to have no idea how his views came about. One thing to note, however, is that according to Varg himself, his mother was quite racially conscious, which might go some length to explain where his views came from. When Varg was either 11 or 12, his father left the family due to his parents' divorce. This may have affected Varg, but from then onwards, he and his father kept very little contact. He still keeps in contact with his mother, regardless of his later crimes, which will become an important fact later on. Some assume that Varg was part of the skinhead movement in his youth, as it was growing within Norway at the time, but Varg himself denies this. Varg's musical talents also started when he was young, as he was a big fan of classical music growing up. He started listening to metal when he was 12. Varg started playing guitar at the age of 14, and when he was 15 he was part of a band that went by the name Kalashnikov, which later went by the name Uruk-hai. Anyone who is a fan of The Lord of the Rings will recognize that name. Tolkien's work is heavily tied to the metal industry, which is something I've always found quite fascinating. This, of course, will not be the only reference to the works of Tolkien. From 1990 to 1991, when Varg was 17, he played for the band Old Funeral, which later changed its name to Immortal. He eventually left in 1991 to work on his own musical project, which he named Burzum. Burzum, by the way, is another reference, as it translates to the word darkness in Black speech, a fictional language from Middle-earth. While rough, Burzum's demos were enough to catch the attention of Oystein Aarseth, Euronymous, who had recently formed his own record label, Deathlike Silence Productions. One thing to note is that Burzum never actually played live, despite being quite popular. Vikernes did consider a live show, and even hired a bassist and a drummer for it, but in the end it didn't work out. Needless to say, Oystein was impressed with Varg's work, and in 1992 he joined Mayhem, replacing former member Necrobutcher, who had left due to Oystein's actions surrounding the suicide of Dead. The rest is history, leading up to the murder of Euronymous. While Varg's trial was going on, many other members of the metal industry were going on trial as well, often turning on one another in order to get a reduced sentence for their crimes. Varg disapproved of this behavior, and to his credit, he never went out of his way to implicate other musicians in his trial, something he certainly could have done to alleviate his sentence, and something that would have helped his later parole hearings. As stated before, after the relatively short trial, Varg was sentenced to 21 years in prison, which is actually the maximum sentence in Norway. His time in prison is disputed, as many people have given their theories and assumptions as to what he got up to while inside. Some say that he created the Norwegian Heathen Front, an apparent neo-Nazi group. Members of the group, however, and even Varg himself, deny this claim. Varg did admit to being part of the Riksmålsforbundet, which translates to the Society for the Preservation of Traditional Standard Norwegians, and he was willing to admit to being a part of this group. I find it hard to believe that he wouldn't admit to being a part of the former. There was a law preventing prisoners from forming such groups, so that could be why, but personally I doubt he created the Norwegian Heathen Front. This was not the only drama surrounding his time in prison, however. In 1997, 5 neo-Nazis were arrested for plotting attacks on politicians and religious figures in Norway. Among their plans was a plan to break Vikernes out of prison, as one of the members was a friend Varg had made while in prison. These plans led to the arrest of Vikernes' mother, who had funded the group, but the case was eventually dropped in 1998. In 2003, after being granted a short leave from prison, Varg tried to go on the run, instead of returning. He was caught after only 29 hours of being on the run, and for this he was given another 13 months in prison. And finally, after being denied parole twice during his time in jail, on the 22nd of May 2009, Varg was released from prison on probation, serving 15 years of his 21-year sentence. Vikernes kept busy after prison, continuing Burzum, and even starting a YouTube channel that went by the name Thulian Perspective. In 2013, Vikernes and his wife were arrested in France on suspicion of terrorist activities. This was caused by Varg's wife buying 4 rifles, but upon learning that all of the guns were legal and there was no reason for the initial arrest, the charges were dropped. Varg, however, was charged with inciting racial hatred against Jewish people and Muslims, and was sentenced to 6 months of probation, along with an €8,000 fine. His views led to his YouTube channel being taken down in 2019, and he released his final Burzum album in 2020. Varg Vikernes can be described as many things. He was beyond a doubt a talented musician, but he was also an extremist in many ways in his youth. He was strictly pagan and anti-religion, a mindset enforced by his actions in his youth, the church burnings being a clear indicator of his disdain for organized religion. When he was younger, he was part of a small communist group, but instead of being in it for the ideals tied to communism, he was more interested in the totalitarianism and evil acts committed by those who have led communist countries throughout history. In his youth, he was also literally a neo-Nazi, having disdain for those different to him. But Varg is also a family man. He currently lives in France with his wife and 7 children, and a casual glance at some of his vlogs shows someone who has changed a lot over the years. He even changed his name to avoid public hassle, and his dark past has mostly faded into history. Now that we have covered what happened to Varg after his arrest and his current life, you may be wondering what happened to Mayhem now that its leader was gone. Well, in 1995, the band reformed, consisting of former members Hellhammer, Maniac, Necrobutcher, and a new member, Rune Eriksson, who went by the stage name Blasphemer. There was a lot of discourse between the fans of the band, since many disagreed on them reforming after Euronymous' murder. There were also accusations of neo-Nazism due to Nazi imagery in the rehearsal room of the band, and some neo-Nazi symbolism in the band's merchandise. Another point of contention was that none of the members in the band were Satanists, as they felt as though they had moved past that point and were unique in their own way. Yet another fact that caused some dismay was a shift in style, as Mayhem became more progressive and avant-garde in their music. In 2004, Maniac left the band and was replaced by Attila Sihar. After his leaving, the band became even more experimental in their style, and even won an award for their 2007 album, Order at Chao. Blasphemer ended up leaving in 2008 due to a lack of desire in the band. But one thing to note is that he continued to work with Ava in Fury, a Portuguese-based band that he created. After Blasphemer left, Mayhem went on tour. As they toured, their members changed a few times. Christo Dreyer, who went by the stage name Morpheus, replaced Blasphemer on tour, and Silmaeth, a French musician, also joined them. In 2011 and 2012, these 2 members were replaced respectively by Norwegian musician Telok and British guitarist Charles Hedger, who went by the name Ghoul. Mayhem continued to release albums regularly from 2012 onwards, and in 2016 a film based on the band and its past, Lords of Chaos, was released. Band members Necrobutcher and Sihar objected to the film, and it received mixed reviews on release. As the band kept releasing their music, they slowly shifted back to their original style, and still have a dedicated fan base to this day. Mayhem still tours regularly, despite having some trouble during the pandemic, and were inducted into the Rockheim Hall of Fame in 2021, the only black metal band in history to have had that honor. Mayhem and Burzum have had an indisputable influence on the world of metal as a whole. Mayhem recovered from their past and are doing reasonably well, still releasing music to this day. Public perception of them is relatively positive. They still have their controversy, but they are still quite influential. Varg built some popularity after prison, but after his ban off of YouTube and his closure of Burzum, he has slowly faded into obscurity, living his life mostly out of the spotlight. From what I have seen, he has a presence on a website called Odyssey, similar to YouTube, but it is nowhere near the presence he had on YouTube. While the murder of Euronymous and those involved in the Norwegian metal industry at the time may have been a dark spot in musical history, it is merely a small event in the world of music as a whole, which is no stranger to controversy and crime ranging from petty acts to the most sinister of acts. But for now, this is the end of Mayhem and Burzum's tale, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate any input from those of you that watch the video to its conclusion, and I hope to see you all in the next video.